مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. أرسل الرئيس بايدن قوات إلى حدود أوكرانيا واستعد لفرض عقوبات مدمرة على روسيا، ونظم جبهة موحدة من دول ناتو لإقناع فلاديمير بوتين بأنه سيخسر أكثر بكثير مما سيربح عبر غزوه لجارته. أظهرت الأسابيع القليلة الماضية أن الرئيس بايدن هو في أفضل حالاته، إنه خبير ذكي وفعال فيما يتعلق بالسياسة الخارجية. للدراسة سياسة الولايات المتحدة تجاه أوكرانيا وأزمات السياسة الخارجية الأخرى، يسعدني أن أرحب بفريق خبرائنا المكون من وان زراتي ودينيس روس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington, a revival of the Cold War, a return to conflict in the heart of the West. I'm very happy to welcome back Dennis Ross and Juan Zarate. Dennis is in Israel, Juan is in Virginia, and they're both going to help explain what is going on and what it means for American foreign policy. Juan, let me begin with you. What is Putin's goal? Why invade Ukraine?
Putin's goal actually has been very clear for the last few years, which is to restore the strength and posture of Russia, to regain influence in not just his neighborhood, but in places like the Middle East, and to reassert his power where he can, where he feels most threatened. And in the context of Ukraine, he has felt threatened. He's been threatened by the Orange Revolution and the democratic movements that he has seen in Ukraine and elsewhere. He has felt threatened by the expansion of NATO, the turning of Kiev toward the West, toward Europe. All of this is a threat to Putin's worldview and his attempt to restore the glory of Russia past. We know that he has called the fall of the Soviet Union one of the great tragedies of the 20th century, if not the greatest. And we saw in his recent communique with President Xi from China desire to reframe the global order, if you will. And so Putin has been very clear about his intentions. I think the question has been, how far is he willing to go? And with the invasion of Ukraine, we see that he is not going to respect Ukrainian borders, and he certainly isn't going to be deterred from taking territory or interests that he thinks are important for Russia and his legacy.
But Dennis, a lot of leaders have dreams of glories past. They don't all invade their neighbors to achieve them. Why now?
Well, I think that he sees a moment now. He perceives us as being weak. He sees polarization within the United States. He sees what he believed was an American hesitancy on the world stage. And he saw this as a moment of opportunity. I think Juan put it very well in terms of what the motivations are. I would even take it a step further. Russia as a country went through what might be described as post-traumatic stress syndrome over the collapse of the Soviet Union. They lost their stature. They lost the position in the world. They lost the perception of respect from others. They were no longer seen as a superpower. They went in the 1990s through a period of economic collapse and destabilization. And Putin felt that the United States at that time exploited the weakness. And he's, I think from that moment, has looked for opportunities to get payback. So along comes an era where he sees the U.S. in his mind retreating. He sees himself as being powerful. He wants not just to rewrite the rules of what existed in the aftermath of the Cold War. He wants to demonstrate not just that the Russians, Freudian slip, not just that the Russians are a power on the world stage. He wants to make it clear that the U.S. is not defining what are the rules of the international system. He increasingly is. And he understood that by doing this, he would capture which he is, and command attention, which he is doing. Now, the question is, how much more does he do? I do think, to be fair, the administration put him on the defensive. He didn't anticipate that we would be able to mobilize the Europeans and NATO the way that we have succeeded in doing. And so he is still, I think, trying to figure out exactly what he will do. In his mind, what he's just done, he's taken what was a de facto reality, meaning he had already divided Ukraine. He already controlled these areas through proxies, and now he's formalized it. Now the question is, given the pushback, given the economic sanctions that have been adopted, does he decide that he will pause for now and see what else he can get? Or does he think that, look, I've already incurred a certain cost, I can outlast the Europeans and I can do more, and I'm not prepared to accept an independent Ukraine at all? Does he do that? I think that right now is something we don't know the answer to. I'm not sure that he's decided what his answer is going to be.
So, Juan, let's take a closer look just for a moment at what the complaint seems to be, or at least the demand seems to be, that Ukraine not join NATO. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and it doesn't look like NATO is eager to have Ukraine as a member of NATO, largely because not many people want to fight for the borders of Ukraine. If Ukraine's not going to be a member of NATO, what is there a legitimate complaint anymore?
Well, I don't think so. I think Putin is a master of creating pretext and confusing issues to appear to be legitimate, to legitimate his actions, his invasions, his provocations. And so NATO for him has been a boogeyman. In his mind, certainly NATO is an offense. The fact that NATO has expanded its alliances eastward, closer to its border, and that Ukraine would even be engaged in discussions with NATO is offensive to him. There's no question about that. But the context for the grievance of NATO encircling Russia and NATO on the border of Russia by admitting Ukraine is wholly pretext, and certainly part of the justification for demands at the negotiating table, which we've seen. But at the end of the day, he has wanted more influence, more buffer, and has not wanted Ukraine to face West, whether it's with NATO or the European Union or the United States. And in his statement recently, he called Ukraine a puppet of the United States. Now, anyone who knows Ukraine and knows U.S. foreign policy knows that that's not the case. But that's certainly the context, the narrative, and the grievance that he's tried to stoke in order to justify for his own constituency in Russia and on the world stage the legitimacy of his grievances. But I think the U.S. administration, the Europeans have done a very good job of challenging that narrative, of challenging any pretext that Putin would have, and certainly the efforts to do what I call a preemptive attribution, to lay bare what the Russians were planning to do with false flag operations and other things to further justify their incursions or actions, has really been effective, I think, and an important part of the strategy to at least have Putin question his next steps, if not stall them. So I take all of this as pretext for Putin to justify what he's already had in mind. And keep in mind, we've had 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Crimea, Russian further involvement in Syria, Russian mercenaries through the Wagner Group in places like Libya. So this is part of a broader campaign that Putin has had. And so he can claim it's NATO's fault or Ukraine's fault or anyone else's fault. The reality is he's driving his agenda and we're reacting to it.
And Dennis, you were, as they say, present at the creation way back when we were all taller without gray hair in the State Department at the fall of the Soviet Union. What promises were made to Ukraine? What promises were made to the Russians about Ukraine?
But there really were two different periods here. There was a period of the Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, in which there was a promise made as part of the unification of Germany in NATO that there would be no NATO forces moved into the eastern part of Germany. There was a discussion at one point, but it was never turned into a commitment that there might not be an expansion of any NATO forces to the east, meaning beyond Germany, apart from Germany. That was never a commitment. It is interesting that Putin himself is constantly referring to the betrayal of a commitment that was made by the United States, by NATO, that there would be no eastward expansion of NATO. The only promise that was made is that no NATO forces would be put into East Germany. I know this for a fact because I literally was there. I was part of that discussion. That is what was committed, nothing beyond that. It is true that in the Clinton administration, they looked to expand NATO, and they did. And this followed a period where, in fact, we created liaison with the Russians on NATO and with other Eastern European countries. We did at one point even raise the issue of Russia becoming a member of NATO. It's interesting that Putin has kind of transformed that into they made the request and we turned it down. It's actually not the case. We actually raised with the Russians the idea of thinking about the possibility that they could be a member of NATO at some point. Yeltsin had some interest in that. It didn't get developed further. But the promises towards Ukraine didn't have a lot to do with NATO. The promises towards Ukraine were a function of getting them to give up their nuclear weapons. This led to something referred to as the Budapest Memorandum, that in return for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons, its territorial integrity would be not only established, but there would be a commitment to its territorial integrity, and there was a commitment to ensure its security against external threats. Now, I think it's fair to say that it was the United States and Great Britain that made those commitments to Ukraine. The Russians obviously were part of this agreement. This was a four-way, the Budapest Memorandum was a four-way agreement. It was the US, UK, Ukraine, and Russia. Now, it's pretty obvious that Putin has completely dismissed the commitments that the Russians made to the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It's also pretty clear that the kind of commitments that were made to Ukraine in terms of its defense and security are also commitments that I think it's fair to say the guarantors of the Budapest Memorandum have also not lived up to.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to take a closer look at U.S. policy and our reaction to the Russian invasion and what other countries around the world, from China to Iran, are seeing when they look at this crisis. In just a moment. All right, we've seen some very efficient, competent American leadership in organizing our alliance, our NATO alliance, and preparing and implementing sanctions against Russia. How effective is this, and how much better is this than what we did 6 months ago when we pulled out of Afghanistan? Juan?
Well, I think we can start with the proposition that Afghanistan was an absolute disaster. So that is an incredibly low bar and was a low moment for American foreign policy in the sense of American ability to execute its national interests. And so even though there was a sense that there may have necessitated an exit in Afghanistan, the way that we exited was a real problem. So that was a real low point. I think this is much better. I think we are seeing American leadership on three fronts. I think certainly on the sanctions front, which has become the center of gravity for how the US, Europe, and other countries are thinking about deterring and responding to Russian activity. That has been positive. There is harmony among the actors, in particular with Europe. We've seen Germany postpone the launch of Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, which had caused a lot of transatlantic consternation in recent months. We've seen the designation of key oligarchs that are tied to Putin, beginning of targeting of elements of the financial sector, and good signals from the European Union, the UK, even Japan, Australia, and other countries. So on the sanctions front, there's been strong unity around the approach, which is to calibrate the sanctions, to use them to deter, and then to see how Russia responds. You've also seen defense efforts, the movement of Javelin missiles, for example, into Ukraine, defensive weapons. The U.S. has accelerated that. Some would argue that comes a little late, but certainly the acceleration of that, including from other countries within NATO, has been important. And then the movement of U.S. troops to neighboring countries has been an important signal to strengthen the alliance, to strengthen the sense of security of NATO members that are closer to the action and may feel threatened by Russian provocations. So on those three fronts, I think the reaction has been good, has been solid, and I think the question is whether or not those actions can actually deter or shape what Putin does next.
So, Dennis, we've had good, competent American leadership, but is it effective?
Look, I think ultimately the question is going to be, does Putin stop here or not? The measure of effectiveness is going to be, is his calculus going to change? Does he realize that what he's done in Ukraine is going to force him to pay a price, but also that he has to understand he is not going to succeed in rewriting the rules of the post-Cold War period, number one. Number two, he's not going to be able to reshape the European security architecture because of what he's done. Number three, his desire to weaken NATO and create fissures within it is going to produce exactly the opposite, given what he's done. I mean, if what I just described ends up taking place, then I would say this has been pretty effective. The idea that we were going to be able to prevent him from doing what he's done in Ukraine without going to war with Russia, I think is probably fanciful. But the ability to impose a price on him that he sees and that others see, I think is also important. But I would add one other thing. We can't focus only on Europe. One of the reasons he went in was precisely because he sees that we're risk averse. President Xi has seen us as being risk averse. Khamenei in Iran sees us as being risk averse. Kim Jong-un in North Korea sees us as being risk averse. It would be very important right now to show not only have we been successful in terms of mobilizing the Europeans into a united front, but we are also sending a message we are not weak and we can act in other theaters, and where our interests are, we're going to act. A good example of something that would be useful that Putin would recognize, that Khamenei would recognize, the next time we have a base where Americans are present in either Iraq or Syria, and it gets hit, there should be a very decisive, non-calibrated response. I mean, we have an interesting example. I'm in Israel now. We know that the Iranians hit the base at Tanaf in Jordan in retaliation for something that Israel did.
Eastern Syria.
Yeah. That's right. It's remarkable that what happened was they hit the United States, not Israel. They perceived hitting Israel was going to be costly. They perceived hitting this base where we were as being not costly. They need to understand that there is a cost, and if they see the cost, the Russians and the Chinese will also see they're seeing a different kind of American behavior, not just leadership in terms of mobilizing others, which has a value, but also that we're acting in a way that says when you challenge our interests, we will make you pay for doing that.
And Juan, Dennis pointed on something that we can do to impress upon the Iranians. Is there something that we can do to impress upon the Chinese at this moment?
Well, I think the Chinese are watching very carefully our resolution and what we do in concert with our allies, not just Europe, but countries like Japan and Australia in Asia. And so I think maintaining sort of diplomatic harmony in the approach here is important, because that will signal to the Chinese the U.S. isn't just acting alone. I do think, as Dennis mentions, there are other things we can do materially. I think not shying away from military maneuvers or activities in the South China Sea or in and around Taiwan will be important. And I think it's a good moment to remind that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, because the Chinese no doubt are calibrating their assessment of Taiwan in light of what they're seeing here with Russia and Ukraine.
Fascinating. I'm afraid I need to cut us off here. I apologize. This is a really important topic, and my viewers are so pleased to have you, Dennis Ross, and you, Juan Zarate, helping to explain this situation to them. Thank you both very much for joining me on Dakhel, Washington. Originally, intelligence assessments anticipated that the vaunted Russian army would stroll into Kyiv in 2 to 3 days, swiftly overwhelming the Ukrainian defenses. That didn't happen. It may before long, but it didn't happen yet. Ukrainians fought back as if their lives depended on it, because their lives did depend on it. Brave men and women stood in front of tanks. Grandparents, who, like the grandparents of the young Russian conscripts on their streets, shared the experience of Soviet rule, went up to those teenagers and berated them. "Does your mother know what you're doing?" they asked. "She would be so ashamed." Another more acidly gave a young Russian soldier a handful of sunflower seeds. "Put these in your pocket," she said, "because when you die on our land, at least flowers will grow out of your corpse." That's one tough grandmother. These brave people are led by an unlikely hero, a comedian, the guy who did Ukrainian voiceover for Paddington Bear, a celebrity who performed quite impressively in Ukraine's version of Dancing with the Stars. Not someone you would think could stand up to a world-class thug like the ex-KGB agent in the Kremlin. And yet, Volodymyr Zelensky has proven his mettle in the worst of times. President Zelensky has, together with Putin, changed the face of Europe, perhaps forever. One represents an evil that the world thought Europe had exorcised from its midst 77 years ago. The other represents a stiff spine that the world thought Europe lost somewhere between then and now. They are opposites, the bully and the guy who stands his ground. Putin has done horrible things before, from killing his critics with poison to leveling the city of Grozny to wipe out its Islamic extremists. But I doubt he will ever recover from the isolation, insult, and contempt he triggered with his vicious and unprovoked attack on his neighbor. As for Zelensky, he is already like the man on United Flight 93, who led his fellow passengers in a counterattack against the 9/11 hijackers with the immortal words, "Let's roll." Zelensky's response, when U.S. intelligence offered an escape route for him and his family, will go down in history as among the most inspirational of all time. "I don't need a ride," he said. "I need ammunition." The bully often wins the fight, but the guy who stands his ground, together with the people he inspires, usually ends up winning the war. Okay, it's usually that way in the movies, but it's often that way in life too. In this case, part of winning means that the world can never go back to the way it was. I don't quite know where we're going, but I know we aren't going back. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بالأولويات السياسية للأعمال في أمريكا، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى نلقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.